Bueno, buenas noches. Bienvenidos a la Fundación Pedro Meyer. Estamos muy contentos que nos acompañen, que haya tantos jóvenes, que haya tanta gente del medio que está interesada en las actividades que estamos haciendo. Queremos darle la bienvenida a Shahidul. Para nosotros es un privilegio que esté aquí. Como ustedes han podido ver en la difusión que hemos hecho y en lo que ustedes conocen, es un muy destacado fotógrafo de Bangladesh y además un activista social importantísimo, una figura muy importante para Bangladesh en el mundo del arte, pero también en la defensa de los derechos humanos de su país. En ese sentido, pues para nosotros representa una oportunidad de conocer qué está sucediendo, qué ha sucedido a través de la trayectoria y de los ojos de este gran artista, qué ha sucedido en esta parte de Asia. Como saben, él también tiene no solo contacto con Bangladesh, sino un gran liderazgo en Asia, en la fotografía, en el mundo de la imagen de Asia y de los derechos humanos. Pues queremos darle la bienvenida y con ustedes, Shahidul.
Thank you all. I'm delighted to be here with old friends and a country that I'm very fond of. Pedro and I were talking earlier today about what I should show, and he came up with a suggestion which I think is very sensible. The fact that we, our country, needs to go out of lights. Three countries that are separated by thousands of miles. We speak different languages, we have different cultures, but there are also a lot of similarities. And what I thought to do, and this suggestion, is to introduce to you this country of mine, and perhaps through that build a bridge with you. So I will start by showing you some pictures of my mother. Yeah, needs near it? Shall I hold it like this? Yes. Is that better?
Please.
Yeah. Closer. Yeah. So the picture on the left is my mother. Now, she was born in Kolkata. She was raised up in Kolkata, and she got married in Kolkata, which is now in India. In 1947, there was a partition, and the Muslims of West Bengal migrated to what is now Bangladesh. Now, while she was there, she was very interested. When my father married her, he married her because he wanted an educated wife. But his mother was not really very interested. So when my mother wanted to go to university, my grandmother didn't like it very much. So every day, my mother would put on a burqa, the cloth that you're aware of, and my dad's youngest brother would take her to visit her friends. That was how she graduated. I'm sure everyone knew what the real thing was going on, but this was an acceptable arrangement, that you were not disrespectful to the mother-in-law, and you carried on doing what you did, provided you maintained the protocol. My mother, understandably, was very interested in education when she came to Bangladesh. She wanted to set up a school for girls in a lower middle class part of Dhaka. No one was interested. So she bought a tent for a very small sum, pitched in the middle of the playground, and with 14 children set up a school which today is the largest school and college for girls in the country. Sadly, she's passed away, but until she was 18, she would go every day to school to make sure that everything was right. On the right is my mother teaching me to play the harp. Bangladesh's national flag colours are green and red. Green, obviously because of the country that is, the red because it's a symbol of the sun. And here we are, you can see where Bangladesh is located in the map. Tucked away next to India. In fact, India has an arm going all the way across Bangladesh, and at the bottom is Myanmar. Our flag and our symbol, which is based on the the water lily, our national flower. Our national animal is the Bengal tiger, which today is difficult to see, and it's a threatened species. And the Sundarbans, which is the world's largest mangrove forest. Yeah. So let me show you that, and I need to put on my glasses because I can't see very well with that. So, okay, those are the figures, not very interesting. But you see that little blue line coming in? That is the river Brahmaputra. It's a huge river, 1,800 miles long, comes from Tibet, through India, through Bangladesh, into the Bay of Bengal. So Bangladesh is a delta, and it's like a funnel. So all these great rivers, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, Yamuna, all flow through Calcutta, through Bangladesh into the Bay of Bengal. But we have suffered from an image crisis. Bangladesh was born in 1971 through a very violent war. And the picture on the left is by the very famous war photographer Dominic Cullen. It's a man carrying his wife who's afflicted by cholera. I spoke to Don later on and found out that the woman had actually survived, but this picture has become iconic and is representative of Bangladesh in many ways. Sadly, the picture on the right, taken by Richard Harrison, is taken 25 years later and pretty much follows the same motive. And it's as if it's an advertiser's layout that the photographers fill up with pictures that they find. And that has to do with the fact that a large part of how Bangladesh has been known through NGOs, through Western media, propagating a particular type of story like this. This is how Africa is described. This is how poor countries generally are described by Western media. It's about poverty, it's about destitution, and my country was also labeled in that way. And one of the reasons I took on photography was because I was very unhappy with this definition, with this label that was on my country, and felt we needed to be known for something beyond simply poverty. So I started an agency called in 1989 as a platform for local storytellers to tell their stories. There's a very interesting saying in Africa, it goes something like, until the lions find their storytellers, stories about hunting will always glorify the hunter. History is always written by the victim and by the powerful. So people at the lower end of the spectrum find they are defined and their history is manufactured by someone else. So I will show you some of my heroes. The person at the top, he recently passed away. His name is Abdul Sattar Idi. He's a Pakistani. And perhaps the greatest philanthropist the world has ever known. But when I first met him, and when I've later met him, this is his one room where he sleeps. This is also where we have breakfast. His wife Bilqis beside him. He runs a worldwide, he used to run, he's passed away, he used to run a worldwide charity organization worth billions of dollars. And he continues to live the way he did. When there was an earthquake in Iran, in Bam, Edi's organization provided $500,000 in relief, which is more than the United States government provided. Yet, Edi is someone you probably have never heard of. He's a bearded Muslim from Pakistan and doesn't make it into the news. The only news you hear about bearded Muslims is when they're terrorists. That is how the world is defined. The person at the bottom, Muhammad Yunus, he's a Nobel laureate Bangladesh's first Nobel laureate. I took this picture when he was not so famous, and you can see the peeling wall at the back of his office. Of course, now he's become very famous for winning the Nobel Prize, and the Nobel Prize is very important. But we also need to remember that there's a politics associated with the Nobel Prize. The Nobel Peace Prize was never given to Gandhi, but it was given to Kissinger. And that's how it has been. Aung San Suu Kyi was given the Nobel Prize, and she perhaps is carrying out the biggest genocide in the world today. But, you know, heroes are there, they're built. This is another of my heroes, Nelson Mandela. And I took this photograph in 2009. It was the last official portrait of the Negro. And maybe I'll tell you about the story some other time. This is another of my heroes, Fazli Hasanabi. He runs the world's largest NGO, called BRAC. An incredible enterprise that works across the globe. In Bangladesh, I think they run something like 13,000 schools. And this one NGO, amongst many others, have really transformed Bangladesh into what it is today. Another person you might not have heard of, Taslim Manasri. She's a very prominent feminist, a poet, a writer. This was taken in 1994 when she was being threatened by the Islamists because she was challenging religion and the role religion played, particularly in oppressing women. She was persecuted. What had happened shortly before that is DRI, the agency that I run, introduced email for the first time. And it was because we had access to this technology, we were able to find a safe exit for Taslim. She was hiding my flat, but from that flat, we were communicating with Article 19, with PEN, with Amnesty, and eventually were able to find a way for her to leave the country. You have not been colonized by the Britons, therefore you don't know cricket. But wherever the Britain has been, except perhaps the United States, where it didn't quite succeed in the same way, they introduced the game of cricket. But very few people realize that the world's top-ranking cricketer is someone from Bangladesh. So there are many other reasons for knowing Bangladesh, and it's unlikely you will have heard of any of them, because the media that controls the information you get determines what information comes through to you. I'll move on. This picture was taken in 1987, and as I mentioned, I had entered photography because I was very interested in social change. I was studying, I was doing my PhD in Britain. I came back to Bangladesh in 1984 and found that this nation, which had been born out of a struggle, a very brutal war of liberation, had again been taken over by a dictator. So I started taking pictures of the struggle for our democracy. This young man, his name is Nur Hussain. On his back, it's written, "Let democracy be free." He was killed on the 10th of November 1987. But he has since become a symbol of our resistance. But we continue to resist. And on the 4th of December 1990, the dictator stepped down. And people were jubilant. We were celebrating in the streets. It was as if we had got liberation again. And I went on to tell the story through this picture, which is of a woman casting a vote in a ballot booth. And for me, it is through this casting a vote that she avenges Nur Hussain's death. So she casted a vote, we had elections, and we had the first woman Prime Minister, a woman called Khalida, and I took her portrait for Time magazine later on. We have since had other Prime Ministers. All our Prime Ministers from 1990 onwards have been women. But I soon realized that having an election does not in itself guarantee democracy. And the process of democracy requires people to be far more engaged in the mechanism to ensure that politicians cannot get away with the things they're trying to do. So I continued to look at the democratic process and how people's struggles had gone. And I took a time back and looked at a very strong militant movement that had taken place in Bangladesh called the Naxalite movement. And in the Naxalite movement, women had become very important. Not only were they foot soldiers, they were leaders, they played a very important role, but this party had disbanded. I went to try and find out what had happened to the women who used to be part of this very strong movement. So this woman, Luthika Rani, was someone I photographed in a place called Jessore. I found her, I spoke to her, I asked her if I could take her pictures, and she started crying. I'm trying to be sensitive in my approach, and I was wondering what I had done to make this woman cry or by asking to take a picture. She said, you know, when I was young, I was beautiful. It was forbidden by the party to be photographed. They were an underground party. I had never been photographed in my life. Today, you have come to take my picture. I want to be photographed. But today, I cannot decide. My husband will decide whether you can take my picture or not. And then she says, is this what we fought for? So I'll show you another picture. This is Champa, another woman leader. And Champa, as a child, used to dress up as a little boy to go to the party meetings, to listen to the party speeches and be energized. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time in these pictures so much. I'm just taking you through a little bit about the history of Bangladesh. There's the other side of Bangladesh, the ship-breaking yard. You know about the ship-breaking yard probably from the famous pictures by Shahidul, by Putinsky. So while other aspects of Bangladesh might not be known, certain aspects are known. So I took this picture amongst a series of photographs because there was a meeting going to take place in London, which was where the new laws relating to maritime travel was going to be set up. And I deliberately took these pictures and showed them at that meeting because at that time they were planning to institute laws which would reduce further the rights of workers. So these pictures played a role and they were not able to bring about those changes. This is another aspect of Bangladesh. I showed you the photograph of Muhammad Yunus, the Nobel laureate. He set up an organization called the Grameen Bank, which again is a role model for the world in terms of how the lives of poor people can be changed by providing them credit. Not everyone agrees with the policy, not everyone agrees with the statistics, but it's undeniably true that the lives of many women in Bangladesh have been changed. And this is a woman who set up a little business from the loans she received from Grameen Bank. This man is Haider Ali. He is part of a peasant movement called Noya Krishi, the New Farm. And what they have done is they have rejected all GM seeds, they've rejected fertilizers, they have large areas of land that they grow entirely organic, and they have been very successful as farmers. So this hydraulic, it is potatoes, it is sufia in a paddy field, and they have done something very remarkable. They have collected all their seeds and today have one of the finest seed banks of paddy and other agricultural goods. The government now, if it needs seeds, goes to these farmers because their own seed banks do not have. There's another reason why Bangladesh is known, and certainly a reason why Bangladesh thrives, and that is because of its migrant workers. These are Bangladeshi migrant workers in the Maldives. These are Bangladeshi migrant workers in front of the Petronas Tower in Malaysia. The Petronas Tower at that time was the world's tallest building, which had been built by migrant workers who probably will never be able to go inside that building or buy the things that are sold in that building. And this is one of the things I try to remind my government, that we thrive because of the wealth generated by people like these migrant workers, yet they're often denied the benefits of the money they earn for our country. This gentleman fled from Libya because, as you realize, as you all know, wars have been created in many parts of the globe because the arms industry needs wars. The Security Council of the United Nations is made up of the largest arms manufacturers in the world. And I remember one day asking the German foreign minister at the Global Media Forum about this anomaly. It was like, I suggested that it was like handing over your children to a paedophile for protection. You have the job of keeping peace given to the world's largest arms makers. But that is how the world works. Let's move back to the garment industry. These are pictures taken by a former student of mine, Desde. I run a school of photography called Charla, which has become now known as one of the finest schools of photography in the world. Taslima studied there. She now is a teacher. And many of the teachers today are former students. And you may have seen this picture, which became very famous, of the death at Rana Plaza. So this was a photograph taken by Taslima. And today, many of the Bangladeshi photographers are recognized the world over for their excellence in photography. But what you know about the garment industry in Bangladesh is not the entire story. What many people do not know is that around 200 years ago, the finest fabric the world had ever known was being manufactured in Bangladesh. It was a fabric called muslin. It was called, in some people described it as woven air. It was so fine. And it was also the most expensive garment available at that time. It's sadly become extinct. At a time when an expensive silk sari would cost 5 rupees, a muslin sari cost 500. It was a beautiful fabric. What we have done, our agency has done, is to try and revive the fabric. We collected samples of muslin from all across the globe. We revived the technique of making muslin. And on the right you have 2 saris which we have recently manufactured. It's the first contemporary sari of muslin in the world. And we put together this major exhibition in the National Museum of Bangladesh. We produced a book, we produced a film, and maybe Pedro will tell you about some of the plans we have about this later on. Let me go back to Bangladesh and tell you a little bit about the fact that it is a delta. All these rivers come into a funnel, and there's the little trickle on the right, which is the Brahmaputra. But all these rivers, these are the major rivers. We have hundreds and hundreds of rivers. They come through Bangladesh into the Bay of Bengal. So Bangladesh is this delta, which is why we have flooding. But flooding is also a very natural phenomenon in our ecocycle. And the damages that are caused because of the floods is because people are poor, and therefore some have to live in places they should not be living. And also because organizations like the World Bank and other organizations have tampered with our topology and built roads and dams in places which have played havoc with the natural water flow, with the cycles. But I won't dwell on that. I'll give you a little bit of history. So the 3rd century, when Marstan was set up, the first residential university in the world was built in the 3rd century in Bangladesh. In the 10th century, we have the earliest surviving Bangla poem. The Muslim came in the 12th century. In the 13th century, Bengal was the richest agrarian places in the world. We were exporting rice to Indonesia and many other places. Partition took place in 1905. One of the things you might not know, while there is all this talk of Muslim countries and women's role in many countries, it's probably not known that one of the greatest feminists ever was a woman called Begum Rokeya. And in 1905, she had written a novel called Sultana's Dream. And in this novel, women control the world and men are in the kitchen. So that's a reversal of roles, which is quite interesting. But also, this was involved in science fiction. The city operated on solar panels. And there were all these technological innovations that was used in these fantastic stories that Begum Rokeya used to write. And this is a feminist novel that was written in 1905. So there was, in 1943, a great famine. And this famine took place when the British East India Company was the wealthiest company in the world. And India had been such a wealthy nation. And through colonization, it had become so deprived. And the cloth I was telling you about, muslin, this cloth was not only destroyed, the textile industry of India, which was India from being the largest exporter of textiles in the world, became an importer of textile from Britain. So it became a captive market, and the people became poor, and we had the greatest famine when 3.5 million people died. That began the unrest that led to the resistance eventually, which eventually led to independence in 1947. But what happened in 1947 was there were these arbitrary lines drawn to create two nations out of what was one nation. And there was a huge migration where 800,000 migrants arrived in Bangladesh. 1 million migrants leave, well, it was Pakistan at that time. And millions of people were killed and assassinated with the riots and that. Let me move to more contemporary Bangladesh. This, we call it Alpana, these street drawings are very common in Bangladesh. And this is near a Martyrs Memorial, which was built in 1952. Because when Pakistan was born, it had two wings, East Pakistan and West Pakistan. The East spoke Bangla, like I do. The West spoke a number of other languages, including Urdu. Their population was less than ours. We provided the major income for the new nation, but they had the military. And they decided that we would have to speak Urdu, their language. So there was a revolt, people came out into the streets. On the 21st of February 1952, the police opened fire on the protesters, and many people were killed. Since then, every 21st of February, we remember these people, and he could walk barefoot to the memorial. But what you might not know is that the 21st of February is International Mother Language Day, announced by UNESCO. And that is linked to the fact that in 1952, there was this protest for the right to speak one's own language in Bangladesh. That is what has given the world today International Mother Language Day. We had the military, as I was talking about, in 1981. Zia, who had assassinated the founder of Bangladesh regime, he also was assassinated, and Ershad took over. Right at the beginning, I'd shown you the Parliament building. I'll show that to you again later. In 1988, there was a major flood, a very big flood. And in the work that I did, that I was doing, I showed photographs of people in the floods, but I also showed photographs of a wedding taking place, a very opulent wedding taking place of the daughter of the minister. So while this nation is being devastated by floods, the most opulent wedding is also taking place. And that show, of course, we were never able to show. It was, wherever we tried to show it, it was, well, made us decide we needed a gallery of our own. In '89, we set up BRIC. In 1990, as I mentioned earlier, Shahidul stepped down. In '91, we had the first elections, which was won by BNP. So I'll tell you a little bit about the democratic process. I told you about 1990. In '96, there was a change in government, and the Army League was elected. But one of the things that also began to happen was the indigenous people were being persecuted. They lived in a place called the Chittagong Hill Tracts, and the military had occupied the Chittagong Hill Tracts. So a woman called Kalpana Chakman, an indigenous leader, she was disappeared by the military on the 12th of June 1996. And since then I've continued to produce work remembering Kalpana. We signed a 30-year water treaty with India, which India has never respected. The peace treaty was signed, which the Bangladesh government has never respected. BNP was re-elected, and they set up something called the Rapid Action Battalion in 2004. This was a special force given unlimited powers, supposedly to take care of corruption. But as you know, if you get unlimited powers, then there is very little to do to control what you do. So the RAB began to do extrajudicial killings. And much later, in 2010, I put together a major exhibition on crossfire, which is the euphemism that is used for extrajudicial killings. 2006, Yunus wins the Nobel Prize. Then what happened afterwards is the election process, because there was the elections were being fixed, and there was a lot of mistrust amongst the opposition, and there was a military background. Let me show you what Dhaka looks like today. Actually, that picture is taken several years ago. But as you can see, there's not a lot of space. It's very densely populated. And it continues to be a hugely dense country. We have a terrible traffic problem that Pedro knows about. Every day, 5,000 new cars come into the streets of Dhaka City. Yet, of course, and you can imagine what that does to pollution, to traffic, and everything else. So let's look at what Bangladesh is today. I mean, of course, by today I'm going back some time. Primary education has improved. But it is true that while education is free, not everyone can continue. Many children have to work, not because they cannot afford to go to school, but because they need to feed their families. There are these issues about some of the laws that are there, which make it quite difficult. But the Hijra, which are the transgender community in Bangladesh, interestingly, have a lot of freedom. They are allowed to do many things that women or men are not allowed to do. They can behave in a very promiscuous manner. They officiate things. They have religious significance. But the picture there, it was taken in 1996. It's the first photograph of gay people that we showed in Bangladesh. And I had then introduced, there was an exhibition called Positive Lives, which started off in Britain, and I curated the Bangladeshi chapter. And we showed this and other pictures. It was the first time that there had been an exhibit showing gay people. And we, in order to protect them, did not use their real names. But we showed the work. It was a very popular exhibition. And the next day they came back and said, we want our names back. So this was a way of them coming out of the closet, of becoming known for their sexuality. So the work that we've done has always been provocative in some way, always tried to open up space for the disadvantaged. What is very interesting in Bangladesh is while it is 90% Muslim, and obviously Islam is a very important religion, in our country, every major religious holiday is a national holiday. So Christmas is the national holiday, the major Hindu festivals are national holidays, the major Buddhist festivals are all national holidays. And on these holidays, the president of the country will greet the minority religions as they will greet the Muslims during Eid. This is very unusual. I know many countries which have very large populations of Hindus or Muslims or other religions where those religions are not given any space at all. I mean, you certainly do not have Hindu national holidays or Buddhist national holidays or Muslim national holidays in the United States, which has a very large population of Muslims. So, Hindu holidays are celebrated, Buddhist holidays are celebrated, and Christian holidays are celebrated. So we have always had a very tolerant society where while we have had our differences, there's always been room for the other, for a different point of view. It is also a nation that's been very rich in culture. This is work by Zainul Abidin, one of our great painters, but painting has a great tradition. And as I mentioned more recently, photography has become very important. But artists have played a very strong role in our democratic movement. They're the ones who've always protested, they're the ones who've shown the way, they're the ones who have become, in some ways, political leaders, though they've never entered actively into politics, but they have been at the forefront of resistance. But art is not simply related to what is shown in museums. In everyday life, art becomes important. So this is a very common pie that we have in winter. And every pie is beautifully designed, beautifully ornately made. And these are done by everyday housewives all over Bangladesh. Let's look to see what is going to happen. This was something that happened when a blogger was killed in Bangladesh relatively recently. And there has been a rise in fundamentalism, and gay people, bloggers, artists have come under attack. But there has also been huge resistance to things like that. So whenever there have been things like that, people have poured into the streets. They have ensured that neither the government nor the political parties can get away with it. And we have used photography very, very effectively within Bangladesh, but we've also done it in other countries. I think this was a road traveling exhibition we organized in Peru, no, in Bolivia. But we've done traveling exhibitions on on camels, on boats, on bullock carts, on tuk-tuks, and we have very actively used photography to reach out to the public, and gone away from doing it in the gallery space, which we consider to be very elite spaces. This is our House of Parliament. It was designed by Louis Kahn. It's considered one of the masterpieces of 20th century architecture. Our Parliament building. I showed you earlier the Royal Bengal tiger. This is where the Royal Bengal tiger lives. The mangrove forests in Bangladesh is a fantastic ecosystem. It's the largest mangrove forest in the world, and home to many species that do not exist elsewhere. Tea continues to be a major export and a very common trade for us. So that's there. I'm talking about Bangladesh today, but of course it goes far beyond 2009. I'm going to show you a couple of pictures after that. So the Army League, which is currently the party in power, wins a landslide victory. But then, as often happens, democratically elected governments tend to forget that they've been democratically elected and want to stay on forever. So the Army League is still in power, and the last election we were meant to have was a non-election, because the opposition did not participate, and 52% of the MPs got elected even without a vote being cast. In 2009, that happened. Then there was a big, I'm not going to go into that. 20 years old, Rick was 20 years old in 2009, but we have a very robust media, many television channels, many newspapers. But today, there is also a lot of repression of the media. And certainly, I have not mentioned this to Pedro yet. I just got news today that 2 of my friends were disappeared yesterday. We still have no news of where they are. These are things that constantly happen, and particularly people who are vocal, people in the media, people who resist, find themselves at the front end of that. But there is also resistance. Despite that, despite repression, there has been that. And I will end with this picture, because for me it has a particular significance. This is a woman in Malaysia, and I spent last year, I noticed you were looking at a book called The Best Years of My Life. So I've been looking at the phenomenon of migration for many, many years. And a lot of the work that I saw showed the physicality of migrant workers' lives, but did not show the human aspects of their lives. So there was the Global Forum for Migration and Development, and in 2016 Bangladesh chaired it. And I took that opportunity to produce a much more in-depth story about migration, looking at family lives, looking at interviews of everyone along the way, from the migrant to the trafficker, to the government official, to the activist, every player I could see along the chain. I did extensive interviews of and produced an exhibition. And this picture was one of that exhibition. And the reason I show you this picture is because sometimes when we talk about issues that relate to migration, we forget that they are human beings like you and me. This woman went 10 years ago to Malaysia, has done very well. She sent money back home, she bought some land. Her son goes to a private school, a good quality private school. So it seemed that things were going very well. So I asked her, okay, so this is happening. Do you have any regrets? You have saved money, you have earned money, you will go back home. Your son is getting educated. And the answer she gave me stuck with me, and I think is something that we need to reflect upon. She said, you know, when I left home, I'm a single mother. When I left home, I left my 1-year-old son with my sister. I talk to him now regularly, I Skype to him, I send him money, I send him presents, I sometimes go back and visit him. But he today, he's 11 years old, he calls my sister mother and he calls me auntie. So for a mother who has sacrificed everything for her son, she has to accept that she is no longer called mother by her own son. And these are some of the nuances of human life that I think we do not bring forward, we do not recognize when we talk about lives of migrant workers or garment workers. And what I think we should do through our photography, through our media, through our storytelling, is to bring back humanity into people's lives and to find ways in which we embrace the other. Thank you very much.
¿Qué tal si le abrimos la mesa a preguntas que le puedan hacer? Por favor.
Shahidul, you had a newsletter. I think it was via email, but I lost track of it. Are you publishing something like that?
Yes, I'm glad you remember. It is a very popular newspaper, went all over the place, but we have been the subject of a lot of cyber attacks. And our servers were hacked and everything else. But that newspaper, the newsletter is coming back, and the blog is still active. So the email list is something that we've not been able to revive. But in about a week, hopefully, you'll start. If you're still on that list, you will get an email. If you're not, if you go to the website, shahidulnews.com, you can subscribe and you will get regular updates from the blog.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking the question.
Shahidul, can you please tell us the story about how the internet became part of your life with the submarine cable and how it all started at the beginning? That's interesting.
Okay, what had happened was we had made a very conscious decision that Britain would not be in the traditional places where picture libraries are, which is the main marketplace of photography is Paris, London, and New York. Now, we wanted to be close to the photographers, so we made a conscious decision that our library would not be in Paris, London, and New York. It would be in Harvard, close to where the photographers are. But that also gave us a disadvantage, because it meant that we were not being able to communicate with the world at large the same way as others were. Telephone calls were very expensive, we couldn't travel across the globe, and we were looking for solutions. So we started something which is very interesting. We started a south-to-south network using offline email, a technology called FidoNet. And this is not internet, this is just offline email. We designed an electronic postbox. So people would bring our server, and it was a 286 machine. So at that time, the 286 machine was the central hub of Bangladesh email. People would call our server, dump their emails, receive their emails. We would collect all these emails into an electronic box. We would get a phone call from Amsterdam, which would pick up this box, open the box, and send it out to the internet. And it would go to all over the world and come back again. We also use this as a fax gateway. We recognized that we did not have internet. So what we also did was we made an arrangement with the local newspaper so people could write letters in the newspaper, which we would put on the internet, and we would get the responses, put them again on the newspaper. So the newspaper became an interface to the internet that people could use through this offline mechanism. But this became a very, very powerful tool. And as I mentioned, it allowed the Slimana stream to leave Bangladesh. It allowed us to communicate. And Pedro and I, our first communication was through letter. Then it was through fax. Then it was through email. Now it is, of course, through Skype. But we've gone through that entire spectrum. And today, Bangladesh calls itself, the Bangladesh government prides itself on being digital Bangladesh. And this happened because this small organization in late 1993 began to use fiber. And I'll give you a little idea of how much it costs. 1 kilobyte, a 1 kilobyte file would cost 30 US cents to sell. So a 1 megabyte file would cost $300. And at that time it was cheap for us because the alternatives were even more expensive.
But Shahidul, I still remember, because I was there, that you had a connection to the internet with this submarine cable, which gave you like a 128K connection, which you then sold to about 65 people.
Yeah. Well, before that, we actually used a technology called VSAT, satellite technology. And here's one of the things in ways in which you improvise. We were linking up with a satellite called Intelsat, which was directly above. But it was a very expensive connection. There was another satellite called Agila 2, which was much cheaper, but was low down, and there was a tree in the way. So we couldn't reach the cheap satellite. So we built a 100-foot tower on top of our roof, put our dish on top of that tower to go over the tree to reach the cheap satellite so we could have affordable internet. These are some of the ways in which you improvise. Later on, as Pedro rightly mentioned, we got submarine cable and we became a major hub, an internet supplier. And we provided connectivity to the Bangladesh government, to World Bank, to Reuters, to the university and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs.
Bueno, ¿qué otras preguntas tenemos por aquí? ¿Ya saben cómo se llama el idioma que se habla en Bangladesh?
Let me just add something while they're quiet, which is a continuation of your question. I think it's relevant while you think about the question. When we began this email network, what is very interesting is that the first takers were some of the pioneers of Bangladesh today. So I mentioned Professor Yunus, the Nobel laureate. He was our first client. Professor Rehman Suman, again, one of the leading intellectuals of my country, the Foreign Secretary. If we put together a list of the first takers of email in Bangladesh that we have, our first clients, it's a who's who of Bangladesh. So you recognize that these were people who began to see the potential that this technology had. And they were the first risk takers.
Entonces el idioma que se habla en Bangladesh es el Bangla. Y lo interesante es que el Bangla, hay más Bangla parlantes que en español. Y nosotros en México ni siquiera sabemos el nombre del idioma que se habla en Bangladesh. Es interesante eso, ¿verdad? Yo cuando llegué a Bangladesh la primera vez, me quedé asombrado de que yo no sabía ni el nombre del idioma, ni tampoco la idea de cuánta gente habla en Bangladesh. Porque no nada más es lo que está en Bangladesh, digo, sí, dentro del territorio, sino en la India, que es a los costados a todos los costados del país. Entonces hay más Bangla parlantes que en español. I would like you to tell the story, Shahidul, which you told me earlier today, transition between people being able to see the phonetics.
Okay, yeah.
I think that that's a very important issue.
When we use, I mean, the whole point, we are not a technology organization, but we recognize the value of technology and the role it had in providing services. So one of the things we did was we set up what are called electronic bulletin boards. This is the precursor of the website. Essentially, you could post something and it was email being shared. Through that method, we had groups that dealt with human rights issues, with environmental issues, education issues. You could create a topic and have a discussion around it by email, group email. Now, this was quite successful. There were all these things being discussed. This was the time of DOS. We were using a 286 machine. There was no interface for fonts, so the Bangla fonts could not be used. What I started doing was to write in Bangla using Roman characters. A very interesting thing happened overnight. Suddenly, the topic changed. All the issues that were being discussed were still there, but new topics started coming up, which were not as westernized, not as Eurocentric. Some issues which related to local culture and local issues. You also realize that people who had not spoken up to that point suddenly began speaking. So they were all listening, but they were being intimidated by the language. The discussion was in English, and they were not comfortable in that language. They felt threatened. That was not space they were familiar with. Once we made Bangla the language of discussion, suddenly all these people who were watching from the sidelines began to speak. And that is also, I mean, on the one hand, the use of language itself, the value of language. The other, that technology always needs to adapt to the local conditions to make it available, because otherwise, one, if technology continues to be an elitist technology, it will never deliver the goods that we expect. And it is only when technology is driven to be something that the average person can use that it becomes powerful.
Did you show the picture of the goat?
No. Okay, I can show you that.
I was just on a little reportaje while you're looking.
Okay.
Esta es una historia lindísima de que de repente, como llevaban las exposiciones a todas partes, en este lugar.
En el camión no.
¿Eh?
En el camión no hablas de ello.
No es camión, así ponían unos postes de madera y ahí colgaban unos cartones y entonces hicieron una exposición y los niños, por cierto que en Bangladesh nada más alzas la cámara así tantito, ni siquiera te la subes aquí, así la alzas tantito y tienes 25 niños delante de ti que quieren que lo retrates. Pero es una cosa que si quieres retratar algo, te tienes que hacer el tonto de no alzar la cámara, porque en el momento que la alzas tienes una inmediato. Les encanta la fotografía, les encanta ser retratados.
En la India también.
En la India también, sí. Y en México también.
Ya son más inteligentes.
Entonces, resulta de que esta niña, ustedes van a ver la foto ahorita, llega con un chivo, cargando un chivito y diciendo que quiere entrar a la exposición. ¿Y por qué quería entrar a la exposición así tan urgentemente? Porque en la exposición había una foto del chivo y la niña quería que el chivo viera su foto. Hay como una relación fantástica entre la imagen, la interpretación de la lectura de la imagen por un animalito y la niña, y toda esta dinámica que ellos pescaron muy bien en cómo llevarlo, porque llevan las exposiciones en barquitos, en bicicleta, en lo que a ustedes se les ocurra, lo transportan a todas partes sin tener ninguna preocupación ni pretensión de las complicaciones de las exposiciones tradicionales. Y entonces la lógica de Shahidul y todo su equipo ha sido de que estas fotografías de la gente del pueblo, pero el pueblo no puede entrar a las galerías en donde está la exposición, y no necesariamente que no puedan entrar porque hay alguien que les impide, sino porque no se sienten con el derecho de entrar a un lugar que no se sienten que es suyo. Entonces, estamos de acuerdo que la mayoría de los lugares crean este espacio de separación social, y entonces esa manera de invertir las cosas, de llevarlos al espacio de la gente, se me hace una solución sumamente interesante y atractiva. Pero aquí añadido.
Yeah, okay. So this relates to, again, how we use photography. One of the things we did was we would do documentary photography on village life. But usually the villagers never get to see the pictures. So we set up the exhibition under a banyan tree in the village, and everyone came to see the show. So before the show, these two children go up a tree to get a better view. So of course the photographer has to go higher up the tree to get pictures of them. So I'm sitting there, one up there, I noticed that amongst these kids sitting down, there's one little girl who's really battering everyone. She needs to get in. She's giving everyone a hard time because she has to go see this exhibition. I was very curious about what it was. So I come down and this little girl tells me, yeah, I have to go to see the show. Why? Because my goat has to see the exhibition. And I wasn't sure. She said, yes, because there's a picture of him in the show. You have to see his picture. So as you can see, the goat's not really very interested. That doesn't bother her. Got me wondering, if there was a poem about the goat, if there was a song about the goat, would really the girl have been as curious or as insistent to take the goat to the show? But if it's a photographic exhibition, he's got to see it. And for me, this perception about the power of photography, what photography can do, that photography can talk not only to a little girl, but to her goat as well. It's a very powerful thought.
Well, thank you very much, Shahidul.
Yeah, so happy to chat to you informally if you want to. But thank you again for this. I'm honored that I'm here.